Okay, so at this point in the class, we are still in the understanding section. We haven't talked about remembering stuff yet. We've talked about the Feynman technique. But before we move on, I need to tell you about something called active recall. Now, if you've been watching my YouTube videos since like 2017, and you've seen my videos preaching about active recall, you don't need to watch this because it'll just be repetition of stuff I've talked about before. But if you don't know about active recall or you want a reminder, then please do watch this video, because apart from the Feynman technique, where you understand stuff by explaining it to a 5-year-old, active recall is the single biggest thing that will improve all of our marks. Now, what does active recall mean? Active recall is basically just a pretentious, fancy way of saying test yourself. And the authors of that book that I recommend, called Make It Stick, say that for the vast majority of students, if you're not getting the marks that you want to be getting, the reason is because you're just not testing yourself enough. Like, testing ourselves is the most fundamental part of understanding anything and of learning anything. It's like, if you're trying to learn the piano, like, you can't really learn the piano just by reading about piano theory. You have to test yourself by actually putting it into practice. It's the same when taking any kind of exam. Like, we all like to think that rereading information and it's a case of putting information into our brains, but actually all of the evidence shows that actually it's a case of taking information out of our brains. And the harder we try and work to retrieve information from our brains, like active retrieval, active recall, the harder we try and work for that recall, the more that neural connection in our brain is going to be strengthened. So to talk about the research a little bit, there is a scientist called Professor Dunlosky. I imagine he's in America because they're all in America. And in 2013, he wrote like this really long paper where he summarized like thousands of studies. He and his colleagues summarized thousands of studies done on college students and school students all around the world that were all about how they studied for tests, for exams, for whatever. And he found that active recall, or testing, was very high utility. And he said that on the basis of the evidence, we rate practice testing as having high utility. Testing effects have been demonstrated across an impressive range of practice test formats, kinds of material, learner ages, outcome measures, and retention intervals. Thus, practice testing has broad applicability. Basically a fancy way of saying that we need to be testing ourselves more. And for me and all of my friends, when we first discovered the power of active recall in our second year of med school, when we had this psychology lecture, it completely changed our lives, because we were like, oh my God, this is incredible. All I have to do is like start testing myself a little bit more, rather than just try and reread and highlight and all that useless stuff that we were doing in the past. And if you want more evidence about this, I'll put a link in the project show notes, project description, whatever, to the YouTube video that I've done, which is like a 25-minute long YouTube video that actually specifically talks about some of the studies that show us that active recall is the best thing ever. And in those studies, you'll see that there are students, one of them, my favorite one, is that they split up the students, these college students, into 4 groups, and they all get them to learn the same thing. One of them one group reads a text once, one of them reads the text 4 times, one of them reads the text once and then makes a mind map, and the 4th one reads a text and then just gets tested on it. And then they test the students a little bit later, and they find that by a very, very long way, the group that was tested on the material does miles better than the group that reread it 4 times or that made a mind map out of it. And we all hear that making a mind map is a good thing, but actually, just testing ourselves on the content is by far the single biggest thing we can do. And I cannot state this more emphatically. Active recall is the thing that will completely change the game. And the reason we're talking about it in the understanding section of this class is because active recall is not just for memorizing or remembering stuff. Active recall is also for learning stuff in the first place. And that's what we'll be talking about in the next video. So see you then.